On this Monday night, without power for more than 10 days. Frustration festers in parts of Atlantic Canada.
For a lot of people, it's pretty tough.
Thousands still in the dark and cold after Fiona. Decision Quebec voters in La Belle Province cast their ballots. Will anything change? Demanding justice and accountability from police. Families of murdered Indigenous women speak out. Plus, hook, line, and stinker.
He needs to be prosecuted. Call the cops.
The scandal that has an American fishing tournament reeling.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin in Atlantic Canada, where the storm has long since passed, but people can't believe how long it's taking to get the power back on. Fiona tore through 10 days ago, and thousands of customers still have no power. As colder weather sets in, the wait is even more unbearable, especially for vulnerable members of the community like the elderly and the homeless. Global News spoke to volunteers in Charlottetown who say they're disappointed by the government response.
Many incidents where we were their first sort of access to a meal in days. We just need government to step up and do something. We're seeing just such desperate need, and it's just been absolutely heartbreaking.
That's the situation in parts of Prince Edward Island, where downed trees are making access for crews difficult. It's an inconvenience many can easily stomach for a few hours, but more than a week and counting, it's becoming exhausting and anxiety-inducing. Power is still out in parts of Nova Scotia, too. Many of the 415,000 customers knocked off the grid have their lights back on, but as Callum Smith reports, that doesn't mean much to those who don't.
People in Truro and beyond have grown accustomed to this sound over the past 10 days, chopping down trees as the cleanup continues following Hurricane Fiona's impact on the region. Ruby Duguay is waiting on insurance to see when crews can remove this tree from her house.
It's unbelievable, really, that a tree that size could fall on your roof and you're still okay.
But as the days go on without power, temperatures are dropping, hovering around the freezing mark overnight.
I think for a lot of people, it's pretty tough. We've got a friend, she's 68, and she's depending on her wood stove right now.
Fire crews are still busy responding to calls, but they're opening the hall as a comfort center because of those temperatures.
There's people out there that don't have power or heat in their homes. I mean, last night we had frost, so we found it important to have something set up so someone could come in and get a warm meal and a warm place to stay if they needed it.
The frustration is growing for those who still aren't reconnected.
This past weekend, I even went to my work office just to get everything charged up, like having to rely on other people just to kind of get showers, get things charged.
But many people facing personal challenges on top of Fiona's nightmare.
It's not easy. I have a wife who is on dialysis, so that's difficult. She's 87.
Many are unable to work without Wi-Fi or power and relying on others for information.
The funny thing is my husband's in Ontario, and he's getting a lot of the information first from Global News, as well as he's calling and checking on the power and giving me quick text updates.
Hoping, like many others, to get the lights back on as soon as possible and get some heat in the house. Callum Smith, Global News, Truro, Nova Scotia.
In Florida, the number of people killed by Hurricane Ian has now risen to at least 100. Rescue crews are still searching for others who are missing. Power has been restored to 2 million residents, but more than 500,000 people are still without electricity, and clean drinking water is scarce. At least 140 boil water advisories are in place. People have been told to conserve what little clean water they have. Ian decimated coastal communities last Wednesday with 240-kilometer-per-hour winds and nearly a 4-meter-high storm surge. U.S. President Joe Biden plans to tour the damage Wednesday after visiting Puerto Rico today. That Caribbean island was ravaged by Hurricane Fiona 2 weeks ago. It is election night in Quebec. The polls closed a short time ago, and it didn't take long for the result to become clear. Mike Armstrong is watching the results come in. Mike, it wasn't much of a contest in the end, was it?
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of suspense here in Quebec tonight. Sometimes pollsters are off, Donna. That was not the case tonight. Election desks were calling this one a CAQ majority within 10 minutes of the polls closing. François Legault's CAQ government is going back to the National Assembly, in fact, with an even bigger majority than it had the last time around. They won 78 seats in the last election. They're looking at 90 to 98 this time around, it would appear. Legault didn't have a particularly strong campaign, but he has promoted himself as the protector of the Quebec identity and the French language, and that appears to have stuck. Meantime, this has been a very rough day for two other parties, the Parti Québécois and the Liberal Party. Both had their worst results in 4 decades in the last election. They've done even worse than that tonight, so very, very difficult. The battle for second place is actually really interesting. 4 parties splitting the vote, each tied at about 15%. How the results shake down depend very much on how concentrated that support is. So the Liberals right now are very popular still in Montreal, very concentrated, so they're leading in 13 ridings at the moment. The Conservative Party, for example, with that same 15%, is very spread out. They're leading in no ridings at the moment. So the other interesting thing about these results right now is the lack of support for the CAQ government here on the island of Montreal. The CAQ is not leading in any of the 27 ridings in the province's biggest city. Donna?
All right, still another majority for François Legault. Mike Armstrong in Montreal tonight, thanks. Alberta will have a new premier by the end of the week. The governing United Conservative Party will announce who the new leader is on Thursday. 7 candidates are vying to replace Jason Kenney. And while, as Mike said, you can't always rely on the polls, the presumed front runner is a woman whose campaign centered on, among other things, the idea of Alberta sovereignty. Heather Yourex-West reports on what's coming in Alberta.
I ran my campaign, as you probably saw, on 3 main issues.
But it was one issue in particular, a so-called Alberta Sovereignty Act that propelled Danielle Smith, the former opposition leader and media personality, into the forefront of the United Conservative Party's leadership race.
What it will essentially endeavor to do will be to allow Alberta to opt out of certain federal laws and regulations that the legislation and the governing caucus ultimately decides is not in the best interest of Albertans.
The idea has been controversial and polarizing, but it resonated with the UCP's base. Few insiders doubt Smith will have any trouble emerging victorious Thursday from a pool of candidates that include several former members of Jason Kenney's cabinet.
The voter base is, I think, 124,000. And we've already seen 90,000 ballots cast. So I think the voter turnout's really high, and that speaks to a change vote.
But appealing to the party membership is very different than appealing to Alberta's entire voting public. And recent polls have suggested that a UCP leadership race focused on sovereignty and COVID restrictions may have alienated the majority of voters who are more concerned about things like affordability and health care. It's why, during a virtual press conference on Monday, Smith appeared to be shifting her message, vowing to focus first on federal carbon tax hikes and children's mental health.
Making sure that we address those issues is going to be the #1 priority.
It's not surprising that Danielle Smith is going to try to perform this pivot. I think she might be underestimating the challenge that's involved in the pivot.
It's a dance that proved to be too tricky for Jason Kenney, who will step down this week, several months shy of a single full term. The question now is whether his successor can help the UCP hang on to power for another one. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
In Ukraine, Russian troops are being pushed back again. Ukrainian troops have made another advance on the southern front, breaking through Russian lines and pushing along the Dnipro River, threatening Russian supply routes. At the same time, the Kremlin staged more political theater. It held a vote in Parliament to formalize the illegal annexation of 4 eastern regions, about 15% of Ukraine. The outcome of that vote was never in doubt. The idea was to create a veneer of legitimacy for what is a flagrant violation of international law. As Crystal Gamansing reports, the reality is that Russia is losing more ground in Ukraine every day.
Президентом принято решение, мы были.
In spite of being illegal under international law, lower parliamentary officials in Russia unanimously approved the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. Another fact all but being ignored by Russia, that it doesn't have total control of all the areas it now claims as Russian territory. Ukraine continues to battle for every inch of its eastern ridge, including the Donetsk Oblast. Russia's defense ministry acknowledged a Ukrainian tank unit pushed through the Russian lines in part of the Kherson region. An aggressive counteroffensive has resulted in the liberation of several cities such as Izum, Kharkiv, and just recently, Le Mans.
A puppet show has been organized today in an attempt to deny the obvious, that the aggressive and adventurous regime in Russia is heading to its imminent defeat.
This 75-year-old Soviet Army veteran is one of many who has taken part in public acts of defiance while under Russian occupation. He eventually left Kherson knowing he was an easy target. What I was most afraid of was not the orcs, but the local collaborators. Russia claiming the 4 regions as its own will make it even harder for Ukrainians to flee to safer cities. The U.S. ambassador to the UN called on the Security Council to compel Russia to withdraw its troops and introduced a resolution to not acknowledge the recent Russian land grab.
They changed nothing about the status and borders of Ukraine.
Russia voted against the resolution. China, Gabon, India, and Brazil all abstained. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Canada is imposing further sanctions on the Iranian regime. In a statement, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly says the sanctions are in response to gross human rights violations that have been committed in Iran, including its systematic persecution of women and, in particular, the egregious actions committed by Iran's so-called morality police. 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in police custody last month, accused of improperly wearing her hijab. Her death prompted widespread condemnation and protests around the world. The new sanctions target 25 senior Iranian officials and 9 government entities. Britain's Prime Minister backtracks ahead, reversing the controversial plan that tanked the UK's economy. Britain's new Prime Minister and the Chancellor have made a complete U-turn on one of their signature economic policies.
But I can be frank. I know the plan put forward only 10 days ago has caused a little turbulence. I get it. I get it.
Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, along with Prime Minister Liz Truss, have been in charge for less than a month and managed to plunge the Tory party and the country into a downslide. Their economic plan, which included a tax cut for the richest, caused the pound to fall to historic lows and damaged Britain's economic standing globally. Both kept defending their plans as recently as yesterday.
With energy bills skyrocketing, a painful COVID aftermath, war on our continent, a 70-year high tax burden, slowing global growth rates, and glacially slow infrastructure delivery, we couldn't simply do nothing.
The ruling Conservatives are gathering for their annual conference. Senior Tories are warning of rebellion within the ranks, and Liz Truss's future as Prime Minister is anything but certain. King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla visited Scotland today in their first joint public engagement since the royal mourning period for Queen Elizabeth II ended. People in Dunfermline gathered to welcome the royal couple, who were also greeted by Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. The King officially gave city status to the community, which was the capital of Scotland in the 11th century. It's one of 8 cities awarded the new status as part of the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. In the U.S., one of the highest profile trials is underway to hold accountable those involved in the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. 5 members of the extremist group, the Oath Keepers, including founder Stuart Rhodes, are charged with seditious conspiracy, accused of trying to stop, by whatever means necessary, the lawful transfer of presidential power. Federal prosecutors allege they planned an armed rebellion to keep President Donald Trump in power and had amassed weapons and trained armed teams leading up to the siege. If convicted, they face up to 20 years behind bars. Police under fire. Coming up, families of murdered and missing Indigenous women speak out about the discrimination they say they've faced. It remains a shameful and distressing statistic. In Canada, Indigenous women and LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people are 6 times more likely to be victims of violent crime. Now, family members of 3 murdered Indigenous women from BC are recounting what they say were inadequate, negligent, and apathetic responses by the police to the disappearances of their loved ones. Neethu Garcha reports, and a warning: some of the details in her story are disturbing.
She was very compassionate, intelligent.
As she remembers the wonderful woman she was, Natasha Harrison is once again pleading to the public for information on what happened to her 20-year-old daughter, Tatiana. She says her remains were found on a yacht in Richmond on May 2nd. After she spent months desperately searching for her, police didn't confirm those remains were hers until August.
I was searching for my daughter's body. I'm screaming to people like something's happened, and it's getting dismissed.
And it's more of a nightmare than a dream.
She's among 5 other women speaking out about the cases of their lost loved ones, including Chelsea Poorman, a 24-year-old whose body laid in a Vancouver mansion for more than a year, yet her death wasn't considered suspicious. Noelle Ellie Osoup, a 14-year-old child whose decomposing remains went undetected by authorities for months after she vanished while in ministry care. And Ramona Wilson, a 16-year-old who was last seen in Smithers, northern BC in 1994. Her case remains unsolved.
We have been trying to find answers in what happened to her, who did this to her, who murdered her.
No one deserves to be treated as though their missing loved one was not important or didn't matter.
The stories are all unique, but their experiences with law enforcement are similar, and so is the demographic of each victim. All Indigenous women whose cases are fraught with what their relatives say is negligence, a lack of accountability, and discrimination.
Indigenous women represent over 40% of all homicides, despite only making up 5% of all women in the country.
The family's now hoping to help expose the pattern of mismanagement and lack of coordination between jurisdictions through their news conference with Amnesty International and the group Families of Sisters in Spirit, whose founder waited 20 years for an apology after her mother was struck and killed by a police cruiser while crossing the highway near her home.
The officer who struck my mother was investigated by a member of his family on the night of the accident and was cleared 3 months later.
In a statement, the BCRCMP called these cases part of an ongoing national tragedy, adding, "We're learning from our past mistakes that have left prolonged feelings of being dismissed."
Sadly, I hate to say it, but there's more to come if things don't change.
Neethu Garcha, Global News, Langley, BC.
Residential school survivors and their families looking for help can call the Residential School Survivors and Family Crisis Line. The number is 1-800-721-0066. The federal government has given back control of a 120-hectare plot of land in Ontario to the Mohawk of the Bay of Quinte. The land is known as the Cuthbertson Tract and was granted to the Mohawk in 1793 in compensation for their loyalty to the Crown during the American Revolution. In 1837, the land, about 200 kilometers east of Toronto, was unlawfully given away. In 1995, the Mohawk filed a claim that the federal government did not secure the surrender of the land, and now, after years of wrangling, about a third of it has been returned to the Mohawk, along with a settlement worth more than $30 million.
We had a very difficult time to move the government away from the idea of surrender or extinguishment or termination of rights. We said it's our land, we've never surrendered it.
It is important to note this is a partial settlement covering roughly a third of the land unlawfully seized in the 1830s. Bait and switch next, the fraud that sparked fury at a fishing tournament. We've all heard the stories, maybe even told a couple ourselves, about the big one that got away. Humans have been telling tales of sea monsters and epic struggles with undersea creatures since ancient times. So maybe it's not all that surprising what a couple of guys in Ohio were caught doing at a fishing competition. Mike Drolet on the anglers who cast a complicated line of lies.
Welcome to Lake Erie and Huron, Ohio.
You won't find many anglers entering tournaments for the prizes alone. Bragging rights, though? You be the judge.
I don't want to sound arrogant or cocky, but I am confident that we should do well
in this championship also, because it's just what we do.
Jake Runyon and his partner Chase Kaminsky had reason to be confident. They just won 3 Lake Erie walleye tournaments in a row, and Team of the Year recognition appeared to be in the bag.
33-91, 33-91, your new leaders.
But tournament director Jason Fisher thought something smelled fishy. Runyon, as it turns out, had failed a polygraph, a lie detector, after a tournament last year. That cost him over $100,000 US. So Fisher took a closer look.
I squeezed the fish, I squeezed the belly, and I immediately felt things in the belly of this fish, hard objects.
And all hell broke loose.
We got weights and fish!
Inside the fish, weighted metal balls, about 340 grams, or the heft of a can of pop, wrapped inside fish fillets so they would avoid detection.
He needs to be prosecuted! Call the cops!
The language from the other anglers got a bit salty.
Do you have anything to say, Jake? I got video, I'm just saying. You got anything to say?
And no, neither of the men accused of cheating said a thing. They just left, disqualified and disgraced, pariahs in the Lake Erie fishing scene.
I'm angered about it. I'm sad about it. I've known Chase and I've known Jake, and no longer speaking, or they're blocked from me.
And that's the saddest part, because tall tales are a part of fishing, but there has to be honor amongst anglers. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Dildo Cove in Dildo, Newfoundland and Labrador. Beautiful place. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.